CIA versus KGB, 10 operations. Both sides want permanently buried. The Cold War is remembered as a conflict of ideology, economics, and nuclear brinkmanship. What the official histories omit is the operational layer, the covert actions, double betrayals, and institutional disasters that both sides agreed, through mutual if unspoken consent, to leave buried. Some operations failed so completely that acknowledging them would have been more damaging than the original failure. Others succeeded in ways that created consequences neither side wanted examined. What follows are 10 operations that the CIA and KGB share an interest in keeping permanently classified, not because they reveal strength, but because they reveal something far more dangerous: the degree to which both superpowers were capable of catastrophic miscalculation, institutional blindness, and the deliberate sacrifice of their own people when the alternative was embarrassment. 1. Operation H, TLINGUAL, USA, 1952 to 1973. For over 2 decades, the CIA ran a systematic mail interception program targeting correspondence between American citizens and anyone in the Soviet Union. Letters were opened, photographed, resealed, and delivered as if untouched. The program processed over 200,000 pieces of mail and built files on American citizens, including sitting senators, prominent academics, and journalists. It was illegal under American law from its first day of operation. The FBI was aware of it and said nothing. When the program was finally exposed during the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s, both the CIA and FBI engaged in systematic document destruction before investigators could access the full scope of the operation. The KGB's equivalent program was more extensive and considerably less careful about concealment. Neither side has ever fully disclosed the scope of domestic surveillance conducted under Cold War justification. 2. The redefection of KGB officer Yuri Nosenko, 1964. When KGB officer Yuri Nosenko defected to the CIA in 1964, he brought with him a claim that would define the next decade of American intelligence: that the KGB had investigated Lee Harvey Oswald during his time in the Soviet Union and found him to be of no intelligence interest. The CIA's counterintelligence chief James Angleton refused to believe him. For 3 years, Nosenko was held in solitary confinement in a purpose-built cell, subjected to sustained psychological pressure in an attempt to break what Angleton was convinced was a cover story. He never recanted. Internal CIA reviews eventually concluded Nosenko was genuine. The significance of what this meant, that the CIA had illegally imprisoned a legitimate defector for 3 years, was quietly absorbed into classified files. The KGB, meanwhile, had known about Nosenko's defection and chosen not to expose the CIA's treatment of him, because doing so would have required acknowledging Nosenko's existence and what he knew. 3. Operation Chaos, USA, 1967 to 1974. Officially a program to identify foreign influence on the American anti-war movement, Operation Chaos became one of the most extensive domestic surveillance operations in CIA history, an agency legally prohibited from conducting domestic operations. At its peak, Chaos maintained files on over 7,000 American citizens and indexed over 300,000 names. It infiltrated domestic political organizations, monitored journalists, and shared intelligence with local law enforcement agencies in ways that violated the CIA's founding charter. When the operation was exposed, the CIA's official position was that Chaos had found no significant foreign influence on the domestic protest movement, meaning the entire program had surveilled hundreds of thousands of American citizens and produced no intelligence justifying its existence. The KGB, which had been attempting precisely the kind of influence operations Chaos was designed to detect, found the program's exposure enormously useful. It confirmed exactly which of their operations had and hadn't been detected. 4. The Farewell Dossier, 1981 to 1983. In 1981, a KGB officer designated Farewell began passing French intelligence an extraordinary volume of material, detailed lists of every KGB officer operating undercover in Western countries, the complete roster of Soviet agents inside Western technology companies, and the KGB's entire shopping list of Western technology they were attempting to acquire through covert means. The CIA, upon receiving the intelligence from French sources, devised a response operation. They would allow the Soviets to acquire the technology they were seeking, but would first introduce subtle, time-delayed flaws into the software and hardware. In 1982, a Soviet natural gas pipeline controlled by compromised American software experienced an explosion visible from space, the largest non-nuclear explosion in recorded history at that point. The CIA has never officially confirmed the operation. The KGB never officially acknowledged the pipeline explosion was anything other than an industrial accident. Both sides have maintained the fiction for over 4 decades. 5. The Abel Archer Crisis, 1983. In November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Abel Archer that simulated a coordinated nuclear release. The exercise was realistic enough, using authentic command procedures, genuine communication channels, and actual aircraft movements, that Soviet intelligence concluded it might not be an exercise at all. KGB and GRU analysts assessed that NATO was using the exercise as cover for an actual first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on alert. Preliminary steps toward launch were initiated. The world came closer to nuclear war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and almost nobody in the Western governments running the exercise knew it was happening. When CIA asset Oleg Gordievsky reported the Soviet response, American officials were genuinely shocked. The exercise had been designed without any consideration of how it would appear to a Soviet leadership already primed by years of aggressive American rhetoric to expect a first strike. Both sides have consistently minimized the Abel Archer crisis in subsequent historical accounts because fully acknowledging it would require admitting how close institutional miscalculation came to ending everything. 6. Operation Monopoly, Soviet Union, 1970s. Subscribe now. Every week we uncover the operations that both sides spent decades trying to erase, and the next one goes deeper than anything we've covered yet. Throughout the 1970s, the KGB ran an operation targeting the CIA's most sensitive human intelligence network inside the Soviet Union. Rather than simply arresting identified CIA assets, the KGB allowed compromised agents to continue operating while feeding them controlled information. A classic double operation designed to identify the full extent of the CIA network before dismantling it. The operation was so successful that when the KGB finally moved, it rolled up virtually the entire CIA human intelligence capability inside the USSR simultaneously. The CIA's internal review of the disaster was itself compromised. The officer conducting the review, later identified as having been a Soviet asset, shaped the conclusions to protect ongoing penetrations. The full scope of what the KGB learned through Monopoly and subsequent operations wasn't understood until the Aldrich Ames investigation in the 1990s, by which point the damage had been accumulating for 2 decades. 7. The Tunnel Operations, Berlin, 1950s. In the early 1950s, the CIA and British intelligence jointly excavated a tunnel under the Berlin sector boundary to tap into Soviet military communication cables. Operation Gold, as the Americans called it, was considered one of the greatest technical intelligence coups of the early Cold War, until it was revealed that the operation had been betrayed to the KGB before the first shovel of dirt was turned. KGB officer George Blake, embedded within British intelligence, had passed the complete tunnel plans to Moscow before construction began. The KGB made a calculated decision not to expose the operation immediately, because doing so would have burned Blake. For 11 months, the tunnel operated while the KGB fed carefully managed intelligence through the tapped cables. When the tunnel was eventually discovered, it was staged as an accident. Both sides then publicly claimed the operation as evidence of their respective competence, the CIA for building it, the KGB for managing it. Neither side acknowledged the 11 months of controlled intelligence that had shaped Western assessments of Soviet military capability. 8. The Mitrokhin Archive, 1992. When KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin defected to British intelligence in 1992, he brought with him something unprecedented: handwritten notes summarizing decades of KGB operational files, compiled over years of systematic access to the most sensitive archives in Soviet intelligence history. The Mitrokhin Archive identified KGB assets in virtually every Western country, exposed operations spanning 4 decades, and named individuals who had been working for Soviet intelligence in positions of significant trust. The British and American response to the archive was notably selective. Some of the individuals named were investigated and prosecuted. Others were quietly approached and given the opportunity to cooperate. Still others were never officially acknowledged, despite appearing in the files. The criteria for which cases were pursued and which were buried has never been made public. Several intelligence historians have concluded that certain cases were suppressed because pursuing them would have exposed the extent of KGB penetration at levels that Western governments found institutionally inconvenient to acknowledge. 9. Operation Mongoose, Cuba, 1961 to 1962. Following the Bay of Pigs disaster, the Kennedy administration authorized Operation Mongoose, a comprehensive covert action program designed to destabilize and ultimately overthrow Fidel Castro. Mongoose included assassination plots, economic sabotage, propaganda operations, and paramilitary infiltrations that collectively constituted an ongoing act of war against a sovereign nation. The KGB was aware of Mongoose almost from its inception through its own penetrations of CIA operational planning. Soviet intelligence used the documented evidence of American covert operations against Cuba as partial justification for deploying nuclear missiles to the island, the deployment that triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis is remembered as a confrontation over Soviet aggression. The operational history that preceded it, in which American covert action had provided the Soviet Union with genuine security justifications for its response, has been consistently minimized in Western accounts. Both governments preferred a narrative of superpower confrontation to one in which their own covert operations had contributed to the most dangerous moment in human history. 10. The Spy Who Was Traded and Shouldn't Have Been, Rudolph Abel, 1962. In 1962, Soviet intelligence officer Rudolph Abel, arrested in New York in 1957 after years of operating one of the most effective illegal residencies in KGB history, was exchanged for American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. The exchange was presented publicly as a straightforward spy swap. What neither side disclosed was the operational intelligence dimension of what was being traded. Abel had been in American custody for 5 years. The full extent of what he had disclosed during that period and what the CIA had selectively withheld from prosecutors to protect sources and methods was never made public. On the Soviet side, the KGB's internal assessment of what Abel had compromised during his imprisonment was itself classified at levels that suggested the damage was considerably more extensive than public statements acknowledged. The exchange resolved a public relations problem for both governments. What it traded away, on both sides, has never been fully accounted for. These 10 operations share a common characteristic that transcends the ideological conflict they occurred within. In each case, both the CIA and KGB made institutional decisions that prioritized the appearance of competence over the acknowledgement of failure, the protection of existing penetrations over the pursuit of accountability, and the management of public narrative over the documentation of what had actually occurred. The Cold War is over. The institutions that conducted these operations are not. The operational logic that produced them, the calculus that treats transparency as a threat to institutional survival, remains the foundational principle of intelligence work on both sides, which means the operations being conducted today, the ones that will eventually surface in declassified files decades from now, are being shaped by the same institutional imperatives that buried these 10. The files exist, they are maintained, and somewhere, right now, decisions are being made about which ones will never be released and why. If this opened your eyes, subscribe to Battlemap. New missions drop every week, and the next one goes even deeper than this.